We wept when we first saw her through the portholes, a blue sphere wrapped in the familiar curves of continents and white spiral clouds. And I remember thinking, with the precise, calibrated certainty I had built my entire career upon, that the spectral readings were simply too perfect to be coincidence, which was the first mistake I ever made that I cannot quantify as a mistake at all. My name is Dr. Arthur Green, and I am the chief xenobiologist aboard the research vessel Hermes. For 14 years, I have been cataloging the biological signatures of dead worlds, sulfurous rockscapes, methane-choked atmospheres, frozen moons with subsurface oceans that held nothing but mineral-rich brine. 14 years of negative results, filed in triplicate, archived in systems I will never access again. And then, on a Tuesday morning in the ship's standard calendar, the spectrometer on sensor array B returned readings that made me put down my coffee and stand very still for approximately 40 seconds. The planet matched Earth across every parameter I possessed instruments to measure: atmospheric composition, gravitational constant, axial tilt, ocean-to-land ratio, surface temperature variance. I ran the analysis 6 times. The 6th time returned the same result as the first, down to the 3rd decimal place. I flagged the anomaly in the ship's log as potential candidate, Class Omega, and walked to Captain Reyes's quarters at 0347 ship time and knocked until she opened the door. She looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. "How confident are you?" she finally asked. 100%, I said, "which is why I'm standing at your door at 3 in the morning." She pulled up the external feed on her wall display. The planet hung there in real-time imaging, blue and impossible and patient. "Get the landing team ready," she said. The descent module Vanguard touched down in a clearing at the edge of a forest so green it registered as almost artificial on the visual sensors. The light from the local star, almost spectrally identical to Sol, slightly cooler at the blue end, came through the canopy at an angle that made the leaves glow like stained glass. Dr. Mara Osei, my senior assistant, stood at the module's small porthole for 3 minutes without saying anything. Dr. Nakamura, our atmospheric chemist, was recording instrument readings with a focused efficiency that did not entirely mask the way his hands were shaking. Ensign Torres, who handled the drones, was blinking very rapidly and had stopped pretending to check her equipment. I was running the first biological screens. The grass immediately outside the module. Grass was the word we defaulted to, though we had not yet confirmed it was grass in any taxonomic sense, had been sampled by the collection probe during final approach. I had 3 grams of vegetative material in a sealed container, already cycling through the genomic sequencer. The machine was quiet for 17 minutes. Then it returned its first result. The nucleotide base pairs were standard: adenine, thymine, guanine, cytosine, the same 4 letters of the same alphabet. The double helix architecture was present. The codon structure for protein synthesis followed recognizable logic. I spent several minutes simply staring at the output, because the probability of convergent biochemistry reaching this level of specificity was not a number I could hold in my head without it collapsing into abstraction. Then I noticed the chirality. Every DNA molecule on Earth is right-handed. The helix spirals in a clockwise direction when viewed from above, dextrorotatory, in the technical language. It has been that way for 4 billion years, across every organism from archaea to blue whales to the bacteria currently colonizing my own gut. The chirality of terrestrial DNA is so universal and so ancient that most biochemists treat it not as a property of life, but as a definition of life itself. The DNA in the Vanguard sample spiraled left. I logged it as an evolutionary deviation. The note I wrote read, levorotatory helical configuration observed in primary plant sample. Notation for further analysis. Possible chirality inversion event at some point in evolutionary history. Does not impact initial habitability assessment. I believe what I wrote. It seemed, at the time, like exactly the kind of small, interesting anomaly that makes an alien world alien without making it dangerous. I moved on to the atmospheric breakdown. Nakamura confirmed what the orbital sensors had suggested. The air outside was breathable, in strict technical terms. Nitrogen-oxygen ratio was within survivable parameters. The complication, and there was always a complication, was that the local flora was not producing the oxygen. It was consuming nitrogen and exhaling argon. The oxygen in the atmosphere was there, measurable and present, but its source was not the photosynthetic cycle we had mapped in the surface vegetation. Nakamura ran isotope tracing for 2 hours and came back to me with a look I recognized from 14 years of working alongside scientists confronting results they cannot explain. The oxygen is old, he said. How old? Pre-plant old. It predates the current vegetation by approximately 900 million years. I looked at the forest through the porthole. The trees, if they were trees, if that category still applied, stood with a stillness that had been bothering me since we landed without my being able to articulate why. There was no wind. The leaves did not move. I had attributed this to the absence of wind, which the atmospheric sensors confirmed. But the stillness was of a quality that went beyond the absence of wind. It was a stillness that felt maintained. "Seal the module," I said. Torres looked up from the drone controls. "We just arrived." "Seal it." We launched the ocean survey drones the following morning, standard ship time, after I had slept for 4 hours and spent 2 more reviewing the genomic data from every sample the collection probe had managed to gather on descent. The coastal survey drone reached the shoreline of the Eastern Ocean, which looked, from above, like the North Atlantic. The resemblance was a physical discomfort, and deployed its sampling array. I watched the data feed from the drone's biological sensors for 20 minutes before I accepted what it was telling me. The ocean was empty. Not low diversity. Not recently disrupted. Empty. No phytoplankton. No zooplankton. No bacterial colonies. No viral particles. No organic detritus of any kind. The water was chemically pristine. More pristine than any terrestrial ocean sample I had ever analyzed. Cleaner than distilled water in the sense that distilled water still carries traces of the process that produced it. This water carried traces of nothing. It was as if the ocean had been filled from a laboratory reservoir and sealed. I sent the second drone south along the coastline and a third into the forest interior. The coastal drone returned equivalent results for 500 kilometers in both directions. The forest drone's biological sensors picked up exactly one category of organic life, the root system of the surface vegetation, extending downward into the soil to a depth of 40 meters, forming a mat so dense and interconnected that the drone's ground-penetrating radar could not resolve individual root structures. It read as a single continuous mass. There were no insects, no fungi, no soil bacteria, no decomposers of any kind. The forest floor was covered in a deep layer of fallen leaves that were not decomposing. They were simply accumulating, perfectly preserved, in a layer that the drone's coarse sampling suggested was approximately 60 meters thick at the oldest points. 60 meters of unrotted leaves. A forest produces its own decomposers. This is not optional. It is the mechanism by which the nutrient cycle operates, by which the forest feeds itself, by which life maintains the conditions for its own continuation. A forest without decomposers is not a forest. It is something else, wearing the appearance of a forest. I was still sitting with this when Osei came to find me. "Arthur," she said, "the soil cores." I had sent the extraction team out that morning to collect stratified soil samples from 3 locations around the module. Standard procedure. The cores came up in 1-meter sections, each section sealed and labeled, and I had been planning to begin the geological analysis after reviewing the drone data. Osei had started without me. She led me to the analysis bench without speaking. The core samples were laid out in order, oldest to newest, oldest at the bottom. The upper sections showed the dense root mat I had already mapped from the drone data. The middle sections, from perhaps 50 to 200 meters down, showed a transition zone, root structures becoming sparse, giving way to compressed organic material, compressed further into something that looked, under the microscope, almost like sedimentary stone. At this depth, the biological sensors were picking up structures that the software initially flagged as contamination artifacts. I adjusted the magnification and looked for myself. They were fossils. Clearly, unambiguously, taxonomically diverse fossils. Shells, exoskeletons, the mineralized impressions of creatures with bilateral symmetry, creatures with radial symmetry, creatures with body plans I did not recognize, but which carried the unmistakable structural logic of animal life. Antennae, compound eye facets, segmented limbs, wing impressions. The record was as complete and as dense as anything from the Cambrian strata of the British Columbia coast. The fossils ended at a horizon I estimated at approximately 940 million years before the present day. Above that horizon, nothing. No animal life. Not a single fossil. The layer immediately above the extinction horizon was occupied entirely by root structures. Fine, hair-like roots, the oldest roots in the core, beginning with the same abruptness with which the animal fossils had ended. I sat with the core samples for a long time. Osei stood nearby without speaking. This was something I had always valued about her. The standard interpretation would be a mass extinction event, an asteroid, a volcanic episode, an anoxic ocean event. Something catastrophic that had wiped out the animal life and left only the plants. But the standard interpretation required a recovery phase. Some survivors, some recolonization, some eventual diversification. The record should show, above the extinction horizon, the slow accumulation of new forms. It showed nothing of the kind. The transition from animal life to root system was instantaneous in geological terms. A single centimeter of sediment separating the last animal fossils from the first roots, with no transition fauna, no gradational change. The animal life had not been destroyed by something external. It had simply stopped, as if a switch had been thrown and the root system had begun. I wrote this in my log and stared at it for a while. Then I deleted the last sentence and wrote, abrupt faunal extinction event at approximately 940 Ma, followed by rapid vegetative colonization. Causative mechanism unclear. And I went to find Nakamura, because I needed someone to tell me I was reading the data incorrectly. He read my summary twice. He did not tell me I was reading the data incorrectly. What do you make of the root density figures? He asked. Globally contiguous, I said. Based on the orbital radar mapping, allowing for sample error, the root system covers the entire continental surface. And the ocean floor? I had not checked the ocean floor. I pulled up the deep scan data from the orbital array and ran the biological signature filter. The ocean floor showed root structures extending to a depth of 800 meters. The root system did not stop at the coastline. I was still processing this when the inner airlock door opened and Ensign Torres put her head through. Dr. Green, she said, there's something you need to see in the sample prep bay. Her voice was controlled in the way that voices become controlled when the person speaking them is working to keep them that way. Dr. Yusuf Dawa, my junior research assistant, was sitting on the floor of the prep bay with his back against the analysis bench. He was not unconscious. His eyes were open and focused, tracking Torres as she came in. The outer airlock door was open behind him. The sample prep bay connected directly to the suit storage vestibule, and the vestibule connected to the external hatch, and the external hatch was showing a green seal indicator, which meant it had been opened and resealed from inside. Dawa's suit was hanging on its rack, fully intact. I knelt down in front of him. Tell me what happened. I opened the outer hatch, he said. I wanted to get a direct air sample. The probe filters alter the chemistry. He paused. I know that's not protocol. How long were you outside? 3, maybe 4 minutes. I didn't go far, just to the edge of the grass. I looked at his hands. His fingers were slightly pink, which could mean almost anything. I ran my portable medical scanner over him. Core temperature normal. Respiratory rate normal. Oxygen saturation normal. Elevated dopamine and serotonin levels. which the scanner flagged with a small yellow caution icon that I found myself staring at. "How do you feel?" I asked. "Good," he said. And then, after a moment, with a kind of bewilderment that was not unhappy, "Really good. My lower back. It's been bad for 6 years. It doesn't hurt." I told him to stay where he was and went to get the portable neural scanner. The scan took 11 minutes to complete and return a full structural map. I sat with the output for a long time before I called Osei in to look at it. The neural architecture was Dawa's. The gross structure was intact and recognizable. But at the cellular level, in the fine branching of the dendritic connections and the orientation of the myelin sheaths, something had begun to reorder. The pattern was subtle. You would miss it unless you were specifically looking for it and knew what to compare it against. I was looking for it, and I knew what to compare it against. The cellular orientation of his neural structures was shifting toward a left-handed configuration. I administered a broad-spectrum antifungal, an antiviral, and 2 experimental xenobiotic blockers we carried for first contact scenarios. I sealed Dawa in the module's medical bay, a small room with a cot and a diagnostic terminal, and told him it was quarantine protocol, which was true. I told him it was precautionary, which was also technically true. Then I sat in the main cabin with Osei and Nakamura and Torres and laid out everything I knew in the order I knew it. The chirality inversion in the plant DNA, the sterile ocean, the fossil record ending 940 million years ago, the contiguous global root system, Dawa's neural reorientation. Nobody spoke for a while after I finished. "The root system is intelligent," Osei said. It was not a question. "I don't know what intelligent means in this context," I said, which was honest. "It's a single organism. A single organism covering an entire planet. Its evolutionary history suggests it made a choice 940 million years ago to transition from a diverse ecosystem to a unified one. Whether that involves anything we'd recognize as cognition. It's fixing him," Torres said. "Something is changing his neural architecture, yes. Fixing him." She said it again, quietly. He said his back stopped hurting. I looked at her. She had the expression of someone who has understood something before they are ready to understand it. I went back to the genomic data. I pulled up the comparative analysis I had been running in the background, the full sequence comparison between the Terra-2 plant genome and the reference database of terrestrial organisms. I had been letting the algorithm work through it in background process priority, not expecting results for another day. It had finished early. I opened the report. The similarity index between the Terra-2 plant genome and the ancestral genome of terrestrial life, the theoretical common ancestor of all Earth organisms, reconstructed through phylogenetic analysis, a model I knew well because I had contributed to its latest revision, was 99.97%. Not similar, not analogous, not convergently evolved toward the same solution. 99.97% identical. The 0.03% difference was the chirality. I sat in the quiet of the module's main cabin and did something I had not done since my first year as a graduate student, which was to sit with a result and allow myself to follow it where it led without immediately reaching for an alternative explanation. My perversity was not an emotional failing, I had always told myself. It was a professional discipline. A scientist who accepts the obvious interpretation is a scientist who stops looking. But the obvious interpretation was sitting in front of me with a clarity that did not permit looking away. The life on Terra-2 and the life on Earth were not parallel. They were not independently evolved solutions to the same biochemical problem. The genome of the global root system that covered this planet was the genome of every organism that had ever lived on Earth, minus a single molecular rotation. Everything here was left-handed. Everything on Earth was right-handed. And one of these configurations had produced a stable, unified, deathless superorganism that had persisted without predation or decomposition or disease for nearly 1 billion years. And one of these configurations had produced competition, predation, parasitism, extinction, pain, consciousness, loneliness, and the 14-year mission of a single ship searching the dark for somewhere that felt like home. The thought arrived fully formed, the way the most devastating thoughts always do, without warning and without mercy. Earth was not the original. Earth was the deviation. I opened the geological archives that the orbital survey had compiled over the past 48 hours. The deep core samples, the isotope dating, the magnetic reversal record. Everything I needed to establish not just the age of the planet, but the precise chronology of the divergence point. The root system's fossil record placed the transition at 940 million years before present. The Earth's own fossil record placed the explosion of animal diversity, the Cambrian, the Great Proliferation, at approximately 540 million years ago. But the molecular clock for the chirality itself, the point at which right-handed DNA would have needed to diverge from left-handed DNA to produce the phylogenetic distances we observed. I ran the calculation 3 times. The chirality divergence had occurred approximately 4.1 billion years ago, almost exactly at the time of the late heavy bombardment, the period when the solar system's orbital mechanics had sent a cascade of asteroids and comets through the inner planets. The period during which the early Earth had been extensively impacted by objects from the outer solar system. Objects that could have carried biological material. Objects that could have carried, specifically, right-handed biological material. I was sitting very still. I was aware of being very still in the way you become aware of your own breathing, because you have just realized that you had briefly stopped. The door to the medical bay was closed. Behind it, Dawa was sleeping, his neural architecture completing a process I did not know how to stop. Outside the module, the forest stood in its maintained stillness, patient and continuous and very old. My hand was on the radio before I had decided to reach for it. I keyed Captain Reyes's frequency. "Captain, do not send the colonists down." A pause. "Arthur, the schedule. Override the schedule. Lock the descent bays." Another pause, longer. "I need a reason I can put in the log." I looked at the genomic comparison on my screen. The 99.97% similarity. The 0.03% chirality difference. The 940 million-year-old choice made by every living thing on this planet to stop being many and become one. "I'll send you my full report," I said. "Read the root system section first." I heard the channel click as she kept the line open without responding, which meant she was already reading. The preliminary colonist transports had already begun atmospheric entry. I could see them on the module's radar display. 3 descent vehicles, carrying a total of 412 people, their heat shields bright on the thermal sensors as they came down through the cloud layer. I had sent the abort recommendation 18 minutes ago. The abort window had been 11 minutes ago. I watched the radar traces descend. The first transport set down 3 kilometers to the north, in a clearing I had not surveyed. The second and third followed within the hour, in clusters, spreading through the valley that lay between the module and the first ridge of forest. By mid-afternoon, the valley held the beginnings of a camp, portable habitat units being assembled, equipment being offloaded, the specific organized noise of 400 people establishing a foothold on what they believed was their new home. Captain Reyes came to the module at dusk. She sat across from me at the analysis bench and read my full report without speaking. She was a thorough reader. It took 40 minutes. "The chirality correction," she said when she was done. "It's not harmful. It's not harmful in the way a conversion isn't harmful. The subject retains continuity of consciousness during the process. Dawa is still Dawa. He remembers everything. He can speak, reason, perform tasks. His reported subjective experience is positive. But at completion, based on the root system's own evolutionary record, the subject becomes part of the network. Individual cognition merges with the global system. Whether anything recognizable as individual identity persists after integration, I stopped. I don't know. The root system doesn't leave records of individual nodes." She looked at the porthole. Outside, the camp was settling into its first evening. Fires were not permitted, Atmospheric contamination protocol. So the habitat units glowed with interior lighting, warm and yellow against the forest edge. How long does the process take? Once exposed, Dawa was exposed for 3 to 4 minutes, and the neural reorientation is approximately 40% complete after 12 hours. Extrapolating from that rate. 3 days, she said. Approximately. She was quiet for a moment. The colonists have been outside since they landed. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the porthole and stood there with her back to me, looking out at the camp, at the 412 people eating their first meal on what they had spent decades believing would be their salvation. If we attempt forced evacuation, she said, and you're right about the integration timeline, we may be removing people who are midway through a process we don't understand. We don't know what interrupting it does. No. And if we stay in 3 days, everyone who has been exposed will have completed integration. Anyone who hasn't been exposed and remains sealed in the module may be able to leave. A small team, the ship's core crew who never descended, and leave 400 people behind. I did not answer that. There was not an answer to give. She turned back from the porthole. Her face had the specific quality of a face that has arrived at the far side of a decision and found the terrain there exactly as bad as feared. I'm going to go back to the camp, she said. I'm going to tell them what you found. All of it. And I'm going to give them the choice. I looked at her. Most of them have already been exposed. Then they deserve to know what's happening to them. She left. I heard the airlock cycle behind her. I stayed at the analysis bench. I pulled up the root system's deep genome one more time and ran a query I had been avoiding. Evolutionary pathway reconstruction, working backward from current genome to earliest identifiable ancestor. The software took 23 minutes to return a tree. The earliest identifiable ancestor of the Terra-2 root system was identical, down to the last readable base pair, to the theoretical last universal common ancestor of all terrestrial life. The same origin point, the same molecular starting line, 2 paths from the same beginning. One path led here, to a planet-spanning organism, persistent and unified and deathless, breathing argon in the dark. The other path led to Earth, to everything Earth had ever produced, the beauty and the catastrophe of it, the 4 billion years of dying and being replaced, the eventual emergence of consciousness and language, and the need to go looking, the 14-year mission of the Hermes. The software couldn't tell me which path had been chosen and which had been imposed. I sat in the module as the night came down outside. Through the porthole, I could see the camp lights, and beyond them the first edge of the forest, and in the forest the slow luminescence I had been noticing since we landed. A faint, cold greenish light that moved through the root system in long, slow pulses, like the firing of something vast and patient and awake. An hour after dusk, I saw the first of the colonists walk to the forest edge. A woman, I didn't know her name, who stopped at the tree line and stood still for a moment, and then sat down in the grass, and then lay back with her arms at her sides and her face turned up toward the stars. I watched her for several minutes. She did not move. More of them came, in ones and twos, and then in groups. By the middle of the night, most of the 412 had left the habitat units and were in the grass. Some were standing, some were sitting. Some, like the first woman, were lying down. They were not speaking to each other. They were not looking at each other. They were all looking at the sky, or at the forest, or simply still, in the particular stillness of something that has stopped needing to move. I saw Captain Reyes among them. She was standing near the edge of the largest group, upright, her arms at her sides. Her face, at this distance, was calm. I did not go outside. The temperature outside had dropped, according to the module's exterior sensors, by approximately 4 degrees since sunset. It's very quiet, he said. In my head, I didn't realize how loud it was before. He paused. There's something else there now. Hard to describe. Like, knowing a very large room is adjacent to the room you're standing in, and the door is slowly opening. I went back to the main cabin. I began drafting the transmission to Hermes. The ship's remaining crew, 7 people who had never left the vessel needed to know everything in my report, everything I had observed tonight, and they needed to begin calculating the return trajectory. The data I had compiled needed to reach someone who was still in a position to do something with it. The colonial authority, the scientific community, anyone who could understand what Terra-2 actually was before the next ship arrived. Because there would be a next ship. There would be a next ship because the spectral readings would still be perfect, and I would not be transmitting from the surface to contradict them, because I was no longer certain I would be transmitting from the surface. I looked at my hands while I was composing the message. The veins on my right palm were visible in the module's cool lighting. The familiar blue-green branching, the basilic vein curving up from the wrist toward the thumb, the structure I had looked at 10,000 times without registering it as anything but anatomy. I looked at them now with the specific attention of a man who has spent the last 20 hours documenting the early stages of a process and has just begun to wonder when his own clock started. I had been in the sealed module the entire time. I had not opened the outer hatch. I had not walked in the grass. I had not breathed unfiltered air. But the module had a biological filter system rated for terrestrial microorganisms, not for something that moved through a root system as a single coordinated entity across an entire planet. Not for something that had had 940 million years to develop mechanisms its original ecosystem never needed to develop, because the original ecosystem had never encountered anything that needed to be convinced rather than consumed. The vein on the inside of my left wrist, below the thumb, the one that runs parallel to the radial artery, seemed to curve slightly differently than I remembered. Slightly, less than a millimeter. Not measurably different. Not in any way I could quantify. Without equipment, I would need both hands to operate. I looked at it for a long time. Outside, in the grass, 400 people stood in the dark without speaking and looked at the stars of a world that had been waiting, with infinite patience, for the rest of its children to come home. I finished the transmission. I sent it. Then I sat in the dark of the module and looked at my hands and waited to see what I would decide.